Welcome to the Martial Archives podcast. I'm your host, Dave Kipper. This is episode 5. Today we're traveling back in time to 1963 to Southern California. The Daily News of Van Nuys, California reported on July 4th, 1963. James Edward Baker today faces a 1 to 10 year prison sentence for the January 29th slaying of a wealthy Corona del Mar builder and hotel owner. Baker, 40, of Studio City, had been found guilty of voluntary manslaughter by a Superior Court jury in Santa Monica. But this wasn't the first time James Edward Baker had been involved in a death. 7 years earlier, he had been involved in another killing, and that time, he was acquitted. More than 6 months before his conviction on January 31st, 1963, the Daily News reported that James Edward Baker of Studio City, 40-year-old former judo champion, may have used a lethal judo chop on a wealthy Corona del Mar builder before fatally shooting him Tuesday. That's quite an introduction. So who was James Edward Baker? Baker was born on July 4th, 1922. He went by Jim. He was tall. Somewhere between 6'3" and 6'5", and well-built. Newspapers described him as a giant. He was a judo black belt, a former Marine, a judo instructor, and someone with experience competing in the ring. He had also seen combat during World War II, including at Guadalcanal. In other words, Baker knew how to handle himself. But let's go back to 1955, because that's where this story really begins. From the Press Telegram of Long Beach, November 5th, 1955, the headline reads, "Neighbor Killed by Judo Flip." The article describes Baker as a former world's champion judo expert who was in jail on suspicion of murder. Baker reportedly told reporters that he knew 30 different ways, including blows and throws, to kill a man. That's a pretty memorable thing to tell a newspaper reporter when you're sitting in jail on suspicion of murder. Baker was 33 at the time. He was described as a blonde, curly-haired, soft-spoken former Marine and judo instructor. The dead man was 43-year-old Edward A. Bollinger, an aircraft worker who lived near Baker in Topanga Canyon. According to Baker, Bollinger had attacked him with a 6-inch hunting knife during an argument over Bollinger's dog, Candy. Baker had been taking care of the dog while Bollinger was serving time in jail for driving with a revoked license. When Bollinger returned, he went to Baker's house to retrieve Candy. That's when things went bad. Baker told deputies that Bollinger had become angry with him over the way he had cared for the dog. Then Baker said Bollinger pulled a knife. Then he pulled the knife and came at me. Baker said he grabbed Bollinger and applied a judo hold. Bollinger didn't get up. A November 6th report in the San Bernardino Sun gives us a little more detail. The headline reads, "Former Marine says he meant to disarm him." According to the article, Baker said that during the argument he suddenly caught a glimpse of metal. Without thinking, he grabbed Bollinger's arm in a judo hold and hurled him over a 20-foot embankment, but Bollinger still had the knife. According to Baker, "I meant to disarm him, not kill him." Baker said that after realizing Bollinger was dead, he called the sheriff's station. His wife also reportedly corroborated his version of events. At this point, the police appeared to find Baker's story credible. Deputies said they found an 8-inch homemade hunting knife near Bollinger's body. and the evidence appeared to support Baker's account. Baker also told reporters that he had won the World Judo Championship in Cincinnati in 1948, defeating Wild Bill Zim of Argentina. He said it was his last match because he collapsed afterwards with a broken back and spent more than 6 months in the hospital. And then he gave the newspapers another memorable quote, "It's a very deadly weapon, but now I wish I'd never heard of it." There's a lot to unpack here. First off, to give credit where it's due, Baker seems to have been a good neighbor. He took care of Candy, a mongrel dog. Although, talk about species classism, why mongrel? Why not just dog? Anyway, Bollinger apparently became angry that Candy wasn't being kept in the house. He had already been having a couple of bad days. He had been jailed for driving without a license. He was probably worried about his dog, worried about missing work, and worried about what all of this was going to cost him. Then, on the way to pick up his dog, he gets his car stuck. He asks Baker for help. And then he finds out that Baker hasn't been taking care of Candy according to his standards. He snapped. Or did he? I wasn't there. So let's assume for the moment that the story happened exactly as Baker told it. There's a black and white photograph in the November 6th edition of the San Bernardino Sun. The caption reads, "Ex-Marine held in judo slaying." It shows Baker demonstrating the hold he says he used on Bollinger to Sheriff's Deputy J.E. Walke. The picture doesn't reveal much, but I'm going to post it to socials anyway. It's basically Baker holding a plainclothes detective's wrist. The grip is reminiscent of what might be called gyakutetori in Japanese martial arts, similar to a wrist grab position such as katate tori ichi in Danzanryu jujitsu. But Baker said he grabbed Bollinger's arm and hurled him over a 20-foot embankment. That could have been any number of variations of Judo Nagiwaza, but there is an obvious problem. Bollinger had a knife, so Baker would presumably have had to control the knife hand while executing the throw. And then there's another question. After being thrown down a 20-foot embankment, Bollinger still had the knife. Baker said he then leapt at him and used another judo hold. Did Baker jump down the embankment to get to Bollinger? Or did Bollinger somehow come back up the embankment towards Baker? We don't know. At the time, though, the police apparently believed Baker and his wife. Sandal maker held after fatal fight. The paper described Baker as a young Marine Corps veteran and judo expert. According to the article, Bollinger had drawn a knife and threatened Baker. Baker defended himself with judo punches and throws, from which Bollinger failed to survive. The article also reported that Bollinger had been drinking. That's worth noting. A lot of bad decisions happen after drinking. A few days later, we get the apparent conclusion to the case. On November 11th, a report appeared under the headline, "Justifiable Homicide." A coroner's jury had cleared the husky ex-Marine judo expert who had killed the man with 2 blows to the neck. Baker testified, "A blow like that is very difficult to control." The death was ruled justifiable homicide committed in self-defense. Then on November 17th, the Topanga Journal and Malibu Monitor reported, "Baker exonerated by coroner in death." James E. Baker was freed following the coroner's inquest into the death of Edward Bollinger. As far as the authorities were concerned, that was the end of it, but there are still some questions. There is no record that I could find of James Edward Baker receiving a Silver Star, which was reported at the time in the newspaper. There is no record I could find of Baker meeting Wild Bill Zim in 1948, as was reported in the newspaper. However, There is a record of judo Jim Baker fighting Zim in Cincinnati in 1949, and the account of that match is almost comical. It describes Zim refusing to wear the judo jacket and trousers at first. Eventually, he agreed to wear the jacket and sash, but the pants were too small. He apparently got them halfway on before giving up. So Zim ended up wearing the jacket and sash without trousers, looking, according to the newspaper, like a man in an old-fashioned nightshirt. And if you haven't researched Wild Bill Zim, it's definitely worth it. And check out his match history. That guy had more matches than there are trees in the forest. Zim and Baker's match lasted only about 3 minutes. Baker won easily, with Zim eventually beating the mat for mercy. And Baker won so quickly that his friends apparently weren't happy. They wanted Zim to put up more of a fight so the audience could actually see some judo. So Baker's claim of being a champion isn't completely without a kernel of truth, but it isn't quite the same thing as being the world judo champion, and that's important, because claims matter in any case involving homicide. Credibility matters. I also found a mention in a pay-to-use archive that I screenshotted, so come on, sponsors. The article was about Baker teaching judo to women at the University of Cincinnati. The gist of it was that Jim Baker, an ex-Marine and former judo champion, was teaching the weaker sex the gentle art of bending bones. The article said Baker believed women were good at judo and explained that the hips were important in judo and that most women had them. He's not wrong. Most women do. Most women have hips. But again, the details matter. There was no mention of a 1948 matchup with Wild Bill Zim, despite Zim being a famous and extensively traveled catch wrestler. There was a 1949 match. So was the 1948 date simply a journalist's mistake, or was Baker misremembering? There is also no record I could find of James Edward Baker receiving the Silver Star. Again, this was reported at the time in the newspaper. So why embellish? And why wasn't the cause of death described more precisely? We read about judo throws, judo holds, judo blows, judo chops. Were the exact details omitted to discourage copycats? Was it simply a matter of journalistic shorthand, or perhaps decorum? Certainly by 1955, the American reading public had already been exposed to newspaper accounts of judo and jujitsu for decades. Details matter when the story is concerned with the truth. So with those questions in mind, let's move forward. 7 years, from 1955 to 1963. Sunset Boulevard was apparently the place to be if you wanted to open a health food restaurant, and Jim Baker eventually had 3 of them. The first was the Aware Inn, which opened in 1957 at 8828 Sunset Boulevard. It was one of Los Angeles' early health food landmarks, and the menu was everything I want to eat right now. There was the Swinger Burger, a ground steak hamburger mixed with egg yolk, wheat germ, green pepper, cheese, tomato, and onion. There was beef stroganoff, veal marsala, beef tartare, filet of sole, chicken mole, roast brisket with kasha. There was also the Aware Inn salad, fresh squeezed carrot juice, alfalfa tea, dandelion root coffee, yogurt espresso, and something called the banana manana. Bananas over vanilla ice cream with banana wine, whipped cream, and roasted almonds. And then there was creme de cassis over blueberry ice cream, cheesecakes, huge soufflés. And because apparently someone thought this was a good idea, bean sprout jello. The philosophy of the restaurant was displayed on its walls. Food should be selected with confidence, eaten with pleasure, and digested with ease. Baker would later open The Source on Sunset Boulevard, an iconic open-air organic vegetarian restaurant that would eventually appear Woody Allen's Annie Hall. He also operated another restaurant called Old World near Sunset and Holloway. So somewhere between being a Marine, a judo instructor, a sandal maker, a suspected murderer who was cleared in an inquest, and a former world judo champion, Jim Baker had reinvented himself as a successful health food restaurateur. But the story wasn't over, not even close. 7 years later, we catch up with Baker again. This time, he's driving north on the Pacific Coast Highway, and he's being followed. Baker's in one car. His friend Gene Ingram is in another. Gene was known for appearances in film and television including Gunsmoke, Burke's Law, Sergeant Deadhead, and Three Came to Kill. She and her husband Robert Bob Ingram had been estranged for almost 2 years, although they were still married. And Bob wasn't happy about the relationship developing between Gene and Jim Baker. Robert Ingram was not exactly a nobody. He had been a pilot for the Air Force. Afterward, he built a successful construction empire. He became a wealthy builder and developer in Southern California, and now he was chasing his estranged wife and her bearded, weightlifting friend along the Pacific Coast Highway. Let's get into the articles. Yes, the articles. The Long Beach Independent, January 30th, 1963, the headline, Wild Chase Precedes Death Trip. According to the newspaper, a wild chase along a 10-mile stretch of Pacific Coast Highway from South Laguna to Newport Beach preceded the killing of Robert H. Ingram. Police reports described Ingram pursuing his estranged wife, Jean Marie, and her bearded weightlifting platonic friend. The chase began when Ingram reportedly followed Jean into a health food store in South Laguna. Jean told police that Ingram had threatened to kill her because of her association with Baker. Baker was quoted as saying that Ingram had threatened him as well. According to Baker, Ingram came towards his car and said, "You won't know where or when, but I'm going to put a bullet through you." Jean reportedly told police that several attempts at reconciliation had failed because she was afraid of Bob. She said he had threatened her life as recently as New Year's Day. After the incident in South Laguna, Baker took Jean to her apartment so she could pick up some clothing. Then Baker said they headed toward Hollywood in separate cars. Ingram followed them in his blue Thunderbird. According to Baker, Ingram got between the two cars and appeared to be trying to cause an accident. Eventually, the three ended up at the Newport police station where they gave statements. But apparently the drama wasn't over. Jean later stopped at a phone booth and called the Orange County Sheriff's Department. By the time an officer arrived, Ingram was gone. Baker and Jean gave the deputy statements about the chase. Jean eventually went to a motel in Hollywood, and Baker contacted Ingram. Two men arranged to meet the following morning at Baker's restaurant. They were going to talk about the situation. That meeting would end up with one man dead. The Long Beach Independent described what happened next under the headline, Love Triangle Leads to Slaying. A bearded weightlifting restaurant owner and a wealthy Orange County builder met in what the newspaper described as a gun against judo battle. over the builder's estranged blonde wife. The meeting took place in a room above a Sunset Strip restaurant. When the smoke cleared, Robert H. Ingram was dead. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. James E. Baker calmly called the police and reported, "I've just shot a man." The paper described the situation as a bizarre love triangle involving Ingram's wife, Jean Marie, a part-time television actress, former model, and health food enthusiast. The events had begun with Monday's wild car chase. They ended Tuesday morning with Ingram allegedly arriving at Baker's restaurant carrying a gun and looking for Jean. And here's where the 1955 case comes back into the story. Baker had been cleared by a coroner's jury after killing his neighbor Edward Bollinger with what was described as a judo neck chop. Now, according to Baker's statement to police, he used judo again, this time against a man holding a gun. Captain Al Atzel of the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station said Baker and Jean described the fight as being caused by Ingram's extreme jealousy. Baker was booked on suspicion of murder after admitting that he had shot Ingram with Ingram's own .38 caliber revolver. According to Baker, Ingram had arrived at the Aware Inn around 10 a.m. He came upstairs and pulled out a gun. He demanded to know where his wife was. Baker said he knocked the gun from Ingram's hand with a judo chop. The gun went off. A bullet went through the ceiling. Then the two men fought for control of the weapon. Baker said, "He was in a crouching position and I fired once." Ingram was dead. Robert Ingram was a successful man. He was a prominent Southern California builder and developer. He was president of Ingram Hotels Incorporated and a major stockholder in Ingram Hotels. He had built more than 1,000 homes in the Newport Beach and Balboa areas. He had also built the Huffington Shores Motel and the Lido Shores Hotel. He was born in England and came to the United States as a boy. During World War II, he had served as a pilot. He had money. He had businesses. He had property. He had a wife who was young, beautiful, and connected to Hollywood. And now he was dead. The Daily News of January 31st, 1963 ran the headline, "Judo may have caused death, coroner reports." The article reported that James Edward Baker, a 40-year-old judo champion, may have used a lethal judo chop on Robert Ingram before fatally shooting him. The autopsy revealed a through-and-through gunshot wound to the head, but it also revealed lethal neck injuries involving the larynx. And this is where the 1955 case becomes extremely important. The article specifically mentions that Baker had been cleared 7 years earlier after the death of Edward Bollinger. The coroner's jury had ruled that Bollinger attacked Baker and that Baker was justified in using one or more judo chops to Bollinger's neck. Now 7 years later, another man was dead. And again, Baker had apparently used a judo chop to the neck. Baker told the police that he had chopped at the gun Ingram was holding. He said the gun went off. Then they fought over it. Baker got control of the gun and fired once. Detectives reportedly asked Baker why he hadn't simply used judo instead of the gun. His answer was, "It was a panic situation." But investigators now had a problem. The coroner's report suggested that Baker may have landed a lethal judo chop to Ingram's neck before shooting him. The case eventually went to trial. The Daily News, July 4th, 1963. Restaurant man convicted of slaying. James Edward Baker faced a 1 to 10 year prison sentence for the January 29th slaying of Robert Ingram. He had been found guilty of voluntary manslaughter by a Superior Court jury in Santa Monica. The jury concluded that Baker had fatally injured Ingram after inflicting a judo chop that pathologists said could have been fatal. Baker had pleaded self-defense. He claimed that Ingram had stormed into the upstairs room at the Aware Inn, demanding to know the whereabouts of his wife. During the ensuing struggle, Baker said he wrestled the gun away from Ingram in self-defense, but Baker also admitted chopping Ingram across the throat during the fight to gain control of the gun. The autopsy showed that the blow had fractured Ingram's neck. Baker denied having been intimate with Jean Ingram. He said they were simply good friends. Jean testified that after separating from Ingram 2 years earlier, she had turned to Baker for conversational friendship. They discussed philosophy, religion, and nature. But a man was dead, and Jim Baker was going to prison. On July 27, 1963, the San Bernardino Sun reported, "Slayer kissed as he leaves." James E. Baker, convicted of the death of wealthy hotel owner Robert Ingram, had been sentenced to prison for 1 to 10 years. Ingram had been shot and his larynx crushed with a judo blow in a room above Baker's restaurant. Police said Ingram had entered the room looking for his wife, Jean. She denied any romance with Baker. There are several ways to look at this story. Robert Ingram was a go-getter. He wasn't going to let some fitness nut and bodybuilder get between him and his wife. Jean was a beautiful woman. Even in the black and white newspaper photographs, she stands out. Robert apparently wasn't going to simply roll over and accept the situation, and he brought a gun to what ultimately became a judo fight. But why? Why didn't he simply come in firing? Maybe he knew Baker's reputation. If not because of the previous killing of Edward Bollinger, then certainly because Baker was a former Marine, a judo man, and an imposing physical specimen. Baker was somewhere between 6'3" and 6'5". He was heavily built. He had combat experience. He had a reputation. And yet the two men ended up fighting over a gun in a room above a health food restaurant. And then there's the judo chop. But that's also where we need to be careful. The newspapers used phrases like judo chop, judo hold, judo throw, and judo blow somewhat interchangeably, much in the same way that we've seen judo and jujitsu used interchangeably in previous episodes. And the exact mechanics of what Baker did remain unclear. We don't have video. We don't have a detailed reconstruction of the fight. We don't know exactly where Baker struck Bollinger. We don't know exactly how Baker threw Bollinger. And we don't know precisely how the fight with Ingram unfolded. What we do know is that two men died in incidents involving Baker, and in both cases, judo became part of the story. I wonder if Baker's involvement in Bollinger's death influenced the jury in finding him guilty the second time. Or perhaps the love triangle angle influenced the jury. It's impossible to know. But the story certainly had everything a 1963 paper would want. There was violence. There was judo. There was a former Marine. There was a wealthy builder. There was a beautiful woman with Hollywood connections. There was a health food restaurant. There was a wild car chase down the Pacific Coast Highway. There was a gunfight, and there was a judo chop. And there was a judo chop. The wide coverage of the story was probably due to that combination. Any one of those elements might have made for interesting newspaper copy. Together, they practically guaranteed it. And there was a remarkable arc to Jim Baker's story. A former Marine and judo man, a sandal maker, a man accused of killing his neighbor who was then cleared in self-defense, a health food restaurateur, a man who became involved with a Hollywood-connected woman, and eventually a man convicted of manslaughter after the death of her estranged husband. Truth is that many of you listeners train to defend yourself or those you love. Jim Baker had to defend himself at least twice. And although he was successful, there were several victims to this tale. those who died and those who were left behind, like Robert Ingram's young daughter. And we've all heard it famously said, better to be in prison than the morgue. We should ask Jim Baker what he thinks about that. After serving just a fraction of his sentence for Robert Ingram's death, Jim Baker was released from prison. He went on to a new kind of fame with the Source restaurant, and then the Source family, what some people might call a cult. We could ask Jim Baker, but he's no longer with us. He died hang gliding in Hawaii. It was his first time hang gliding. He thought that he was a kind of divinity. He crashed down to the ground and died 9 hours later. He had escaped death many times before, in World War II, in Topanga Canyon, on the Sunset Strip, no doubt other times as well. And perhaps he thought he could survive his first foray into hang gliding, with absolutely no hang gliding experience, or any kind of hang gliding coaching. That part of Jim Baker's life has already been explored by a number of podcasts. And this is the Martial Archives. I'm your host, Dave Kipper. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Martial Archives podcast, please follow the show and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a training partner. Until next time, tap and grow.